Alisa Solomon, welcome to UWM.
Thank you.
Alisa is director of the MA in Arts Journalism at Columbia Journalism School, longtime theater critic and other things for the Village Voice, author and editor of several very interesting books on theater and culture, some of that having to do with Jewish things, but all kinds of other things too. And most recently, the author of Wonder of Wonders, A Cultural History of Fiddler on the Roof. Had a wonderful reading at Boswell last night, so thank you for that. And as I've said to you, I really admire the book. It's a wonderful read. As many times as I've seen Fiddler and read the Tevye stories and taught them and taught the film, there's so much that's new in the book that I really almost don't know where to start. But one of the really big revelations for me, you say in the book that Jerome Robbins, the director and choreographer, labored mightily to burn away the schmaltz, which is literally chicken fat, but it means sentimentality in a word, that for 2 decades had encased the world of the shtetl like amber. The shtetl being the Eastern European market towns where many Jews lived, and that Fiddler on the Roof helps turn into this sort of iconic mythical place, right? So, and that schmaltz has also gotten layered onto Fiddler itself, and as you demonstrate, that starts happening pretty much immediately. But one of the things that your book does is bring us right back to the very genesis of the show, actually long before that too, with its sort of prehistory. But in terms of Fiddler itself, you bring us back to that moment where this is all happening, and show us how hard Robbins and everyone else who was creating the show, Bach and Harnick and Stein and the designers and ultimately the performers, work to make it unsentimental. Can you say a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, and first let me just thank you very much for having me and having a great time here in Milwaukee. That was one of the most surprising things I found in doing the research and reading the notes that Jerry Robbins was writing as he was working on the script, marginalia and drafts of the script and his own production notes and so on, when he kept saying, I don't want this to be sentimental or schmaltzy. Because, as you said, we all think of Fiddler as being so sentimental. So I wondered, what can he possibly mean? And one thing I found is that I think he was reacting to the representations of the shtetl and of Tevye from the 50s that were way schmaltzier than what we've come to know and mostly love, at least us two, in Fiddler on the Roof. So that there's a kind of tough-mindedness that he was after, a kind of energy and pride, and not begging for acceptance, and not too cutesy kind of way of representing these characters and this place, which he had perceived in an earlier treatment of the Tevye stories for the stage, not a musical, a stage adaptation by Arnold Pearl. And also, I think the schmaltziest one ever was a radio version for The Eternal Light, the Jewish radio program that later became a TV program through the 50s.
When you're describing this process of this bunch of Jewish guys, but who, for the most part, were, Jewishness was not central to their everyday lives or their identities. They weren't necessarily very knowledgeable about the world of the shtetl. As you say, it's zero Mostel, the outsized in every way and total pain in the neck star and genius who comes in, and he really knows that world, and as you show in many, at least now funny scenes, lords that over, particularly Robbins. But they have various connections to that world, and in some cases, like Robbins, even theatrical connections. He had gotten his start with the great Maury Schwartz, who had done a much earlier version of the Tevye stories, and Robbins was in something else of Schwartz's, and so there are various sort of Schwartz connections there. there's also this wonderful sequence where Robbins is going to all of these Hasidic weddings and things like that to be brought into this world. Well, how does this dance work? And one of the things that clearly surprised him, and I think is surprising now, looking back at it, is his reaction to all of that. And though in your book, and a lot of this coming from his notes, words like virility and I don't know if the word muscularity, but there's very much this sense of this world of Eastern European Jewish dance, particularly among these men who are doing all these circle dances and tossing each other around, as being something very vigorous and even, I don't think this word appears anywhere in the book, but sort of macho. And that's not that's I think part of what's gotten sort of covered over by the schmaltz, is there's part of the sort of mythos of the shtetl that long predates Fiddler, is this world of the yeshiva and a bunch of skinny, pale students sitting on the bench all day, and so much of modern Jewish culture and even politics has been a reaction against that. A lot of the ethos of Zionism is we're not going to be like these weak Eastern Europeans who are victims all the time. We're going to look after ourselves, and we're going to go out there and we're going to work the land, and we're going to be tan and muscular and all of that. And I was fascinated to see that Fiddler actually, particularly in Robbins' hand, is sort of an example of that too. It's actually kind of a powerful example of a creative team, almost in the process of, it's not sort of in the Soviet way, we're going to make a modern Soviet Jew, we're going to make the Fiddlerized Jew or something, but it almost is that sort of thing. We're going to take something and recreate ourselves as artists and sort of our audiences by rediscovering something about the shtetl that's gotten totally lost.
I think that's right. And I think it cuts, it goes in a few directions at the same time, a few contradictory ways. So on the one hand, I think that's absolutely right. And Robbins himself was completely anxious and disturbed by an idea of wimpy Jewish masculinity. It's part of why he didn't want to be Jewish, and he says this in his notes and notes toward an autobiography. He explicitly says, "I didn't want to have anything to do with it." It's and he even not justifies, but he explains his having named names before the House Un-American Activities Committee because it was the thing that Jews wouldn't do, and so that's why he did it.
Yeah, that's an interesting rationalization.
Yes, very. And he was running away from that identity because of its wimpiness, the perceived wimpiness, which of course intersected, I think, with his early shame. He came to terms with it later, but his early shame about being gay. These two stereotypes kind of overlapping. And so when he went to see dance as part of what one can only describe as ethnographic field work, as part of his research for Fiddler, he was just blown away by how vigorous and virile and macho the dancing was among the men. Of course, men didn't dance together with women, they just danced with each other. It's very athletic, and we see him transfer that into the show with the L'chaim dance. But there the Jews are kind of weaker than the Russians, but he deliberately cast the stronger looking dancers as the Jewish dancers in that scene, and then of course the bottle dance, which is very athletic and difficult and powerful, and the foot stomping and the guys flinging themselves and each other around it.
And sometimes knocking themselves unconscious.
Yes, that happened once. So all of that is very powerful aspect of the show, and I think does redress a more general Jewish American anxiety about that stereotype. And then there's Zero Mostel and the Tevye character, who's never been a wimpy yeshiva bacher. He starts as a hauler of wood in the earlier Tevye stories, not in the show, but he becomes a dairyman because he helps some women who are lost in the woods who turn out to be wealthy, and he gets he's able to get a cow with his reward, and then he becomes he lives in the original stories. He doesn't live in the shtetl. He lives in the outskirts in the village, and he's a strong nature guy. So he's not that image either, and I think that carries over. And then you have a robust, larger-than-life actor like Zero Mostel in the part. So there's all of that going on, but there's something else going on at the same time that I think also picks up on a and presents in a positive light a kind of femininity in Jewish masculinity in the Tevye character, who, after all, is a milchiker, a milky one, is what it really means. It doesn't mean dairyman. And
it's actually
as opposed to Fleischiker.
Not a word that people use to describe a person.
No.
You talk about it as a category of food.
Exactly. So, and the milky is, the milkic as opposed to the meaty. So there's something feminizing about that idea, at least in stereotypical terms, as the way we understand Tevye at the beginning, sort of embedded in the Tevye character. And he's also kind of, in the structure of musical, I think of him as kind of in the Ethel Merman role. These big brassy women who were the center of shows like Gypsy or Hello Dolly or something like that. And Tevye has that same kind of centrality, that down center stage, I'm it kind of. We see this through his point of view, and so I think there are ways in which the gender is complicated. The play of gender in the representation of the show is complicated in that way.
And the Jewishness is very complicated too, both in the creation and the execution of the play and later the film, and also in the reactions to it, and then in the many, many offshoots. And you take us off to Israel and Poland and Brownsville, Brooklyn in the 1960s, and all of these sorts of things. And to me, one of the most important themes of the book is the way that here we have this, these stories by the most beloved Yiddish writer, one of the most beloved Jewish writers ever, that come to be seen, as you were talking about last night, as sort of quintessentially folksy, although that was, Sholem Aleichem's rather clever construction of himself and the world that he created. And this creative team takes these stories, works them into something, immerse themselves in, as you say, ethnographic research and other kinds of research, some of it coming from sources that are themselves problematic, but in any case, no question about the seriousness of the endeavor and wanting to get all of the details right, even as they fashion a work of their own. At the same time, you reach a lot of, I think, counterintuitive, although very well-supported conclusions about ways in which some of the core messages of the play aren't really about being Jewish. For example, Robbins using, this is the early 60s as this is developing, and Robbins explicitly talking about the civil rights movement and using the situation of, say, African Americans in the South being segregated and discriminated against to help the actors, some of whom are Jewish and some of whom are not, to understand the situation of Jews in the shtetl. That circles around in interesting ways in this production, school production in Brownsville in 68, 69, amidst horrible racial tensions in New York City. So there are all these ways, and the play and the creation of the play intersect with, and today's the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. You talk about ways in which Fiddler connects with that and that atmosphere. Philip Roth is coming on the scene. The feminine mystique is coming out as this is being created. There's all kinds of new legislation about both race and sex-based discrimination.
And immigration policies.
And immigration policy. So it's all of these other things. It's this play that we just see as so Jewish. It's also become so international. So it's full of these tantalizing contradictions.
Yeah, I could come into from any angle into some of that. I think it's also very American. It's very Jewish, it's very international or universal, but it's for all of the reasons that you just mentioned. It's very much responding to the American moment of the early to mid '60s. The authors are working on it. Steinbach and Harnack started earlier, but by the time Robbins comes into it, it's 1963, and when it really heats up, and they're really working on it, and then start rehearsing in the spring of '64 to open in September '64. Everything was roiling up, and it's all part of what they bring into the rehearsal room. And you mentioned today's the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. They were doing auditions that day, and it's very memorable, terrible moment for Joanna Merwin, who basically was cast suicidal, that day. Came out of the audition to find people sitting around the radio and crying, and the company trying to decide, should they keep going or not. And I think that the Kennedy moment, Kennedy was associated with Camelot, but I think that Fiddler actually is the musical that fits his vision of America more greatly because of his commitment to an early commitment, I think, to a new idea of multiculturalism, to bringing immigrant stories into how we define our American selves. There was a shift in our origin story in a way that started to celebrate immigrant origins more. Kennedy was the first president to honor that past of his own. He took a trip to Ireland and made a famous statement about how much he loved Ireland. And also this theme of tolerance, a liberal idea of civil rights as tolerance, and that parallel that Robbins was trying to get at. The actors thought it was silly, actually, to be doing rehearsal exercises based on racial discrimination. But nonetheless, in Robbins's mind, and in anybody's in that moment, the idea of discrimination could not leave that aside. And I think that as the limits of liberalism became more and more obvious, and therefore movements to redress inequality became more militant, then Jews are a little taken aback, and that's only a few short years later, when we're in the midst of the Ocean Hill-Brownsville teachers' strike, where, as you mentioned, there's a junior high production that comes under attack. Things are quite different by then.
And we'll have to leave that to people to go and read the book and find that's an incredibly moving chapter, and so much else in the book. It's moving and at times hilariously funny. The whole I was thinking of a book like Moss Hart's Act One, when you're that whole world of this production coming together. It's so vivid. I also thought, as you have those three initial creators, and then Robbins comes aboard, and then Mostel, and then costume and lighting, etc. And I thought, this is like watching the Seven Samurai. It's like, we got a person with this skill, and he's going to come in, and then there's that one, and ultimately, you bring us right up to opening night and beyond. So thank you so much for the book, and thanks for being here. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you, Joel.